Welcome to Young Heretics, where today we're tackling the question that's been on everyone's mind: what is a plagiarist? Alright, it's not every day that an ongoing story in the news is just perfectly positioned to speak to almost every major concern of this here little podcast. But that is certainly what's going on right now with this Claudine Gay story, the ex-president of Harvard. If you've been following this in the news, it's been going on for a while. Christopher Rufo and a number of others have been exposing this woman, Claudine Gay, who was the president of Harvard and who absolutely covered herself in shame at a House hearing before the House of Representatives when she failed to emphatically assert that Harvard was against people calling for the genocide of Jews, when it's been obvious for some time that Harvard has a very low view of free speech in almost every other context except anti-Jewish, anti-Israel statements and speech, which they're happy to allow. So that was the kind of inciting incident of this whole saga, but it's now unfolded way, way beyond that into a fight over plagiarism and over Gay's actual body of public published work. So Claudine Gay, who I always say her middle name should be Fake And, Claudine Gay, middle name Fake And, has become kind of this flashpoint for talking about higher education and the failure of higher education, the failure of elite academic institutions in this country to live up to their high and I would even say sacred calling. It's because of that failure that something like this podcast exists. That's why I'm here. That's why we're here having this conversation instead of something else, instead of happily operating in a world where you can get a classical education just at any major institution or even in high school or elementary school. The reason that I call this show The Classical Education You Didn't Know You Were Missing is because it turns out people are being denied soul food without even being told that it's being denied to them, because it's been made out to be evil and patriarchal and cis, hetero, sexist, whatever, backwards, evil, nasty, all by the kinds of people that Claudine Gay, middle name Fake And, has come to represent. She stands in this debacle for a certain kind of administrator who is engaged in the systematic dismantlement of what used to be the classical American education canon, the baseline of what it took to be educated, the gradual lowering of standards and the replacement of academic standards and Western civilization and high culture with this series of incredibly atavistic, dull, and backward-looking ideas about race and how we need to elevate certain people of certain races and genders and sexualities, and this never-ending attempt to reshuffle the deck of power and influence in America, which always ends up being a corrupt enterprise because it shifts the focus away from truth, away from goodness, away from beauty, and toward who gets what and who scratches whose back. And now, there is always some level of that in any major institution, but at the very least, we ought to espouse ideals. We ought to aspire to create institutions that have more than just power and influence at stake. And so what's being revealed here, I think, or what's being really stressed in people like Chris Rufo's arguments and efforts to unseat Gay, successful efforts to unseat Gay, is the fact that these institutions have betrayed their trust fundamentally. They no longer deserve the public's trust. And so what I wanted to do today on the show is think a little bit more deeply about why that is, because it speaks right to the heart of our project. And if we can think about what has gone so wrong at a place like Harvard, then maybe we can also think more seriously and deeply about what this show is here to do, why we want to do a classical education at all. And I want to focus in. It turns out this also has to do with my favorite themes for this year about honesty in art, morality in art, and representation, and how do you communicate beautifully and truly in any kind of medium, be it fictional or non-fictional. So we're going to get into that, and only on this podcast are you going to hear how Claudine Gay leads you into a reading of Shakespeare, Giorgio Vasari, and Plato. But we are going to get there. And the reason we're going to get there is because you're going to hear, and you're already hearing probably if you're following this news story, you are going to hear a lot of people say something along the lines of, this really isn't that bad. What Claudine Gay did in her published work, these plagiarized chunks and sections from her essays and dissertation and so forth, this is kind of the sort of thing that happens. People make mistakes. Whomst among us? Who among us has not found him or herself embroiled in the midst of a national scandal over the fraudulent plagiarism in his or her published work? Basically, that this is just something that happens as you're in the messy business of academia. Sometimes you end up slipping in some stuff that you should have put quotes around, but you didn't put quotes around it or whatever. And the only reason that Chris Rufo and conservatives and evil, nasty, pouncing Republicans are going after this at all is because of who Claudine Gay is, what she represents to them, the corruption of higher education that they fallaciously apparently think exists, and also the fact that she's black and a woman. In fact, the first, I believe, black woman president of Harvard. And so the defenders of Gay and of Harvard and of the Ivies more generally are going to try to make it seem like this was a nothing burger, and it's only because of who Claudine Gay is, because those are the only terms they can think of now. They can only think in terms of race and sex and sexuality and so forth, although I don't actually think that Claudine Gay, ironically, is in fact gay, although I could be wrong about that. I'm not entirely sure. I do know that she is fake and gay, however, in the sense that I'm about to articulate, because here, let me set up some of what people will start to say and are starting to say. In the New Yorker, which is kind of a perfect example outlet for the sort of venue where you're going to hear defenses of Claudine Gay and of Harvard. The New York Times also has run Gay's own writing and their own editorial and so forth. But in the New Yorker, they interviewed this guy, Dr. Stephen Voss, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Kentucky, and he and Gay knew each other, and Voss is one of the people from whom Gay plagiarized. So this president of Harvard, she's publishing supposedly her own work, but she's lifting chunks from Voss's own work and kind of passing it off as her own, or at least not quoting it, not putting quotes around it where she ought to. And she says, or Voss rather says, this isn't actually all that bad in this interview. And he's defending her for having plagiarized from him. And he says, I use the analogy of speeding. If you're driving 57 miles per hour on a 55 mile per hour highway, that's technically speeding. But we don't expect law enforcement to crack down anytime behavior crosses over the line. The plagiarism in question here did not take an idea of any significance from my work. It didn't steal my thunder. It didn't stop me from publishing. And the bit she used from us was not in any way a major component of what made her research important or valuable. First of all, before we get into anything else, BS. This is hogwash. If this were any other person at any other time, do you think that this guy would be defending her and her having stolen his ideas and quoted directly from him without citing sources? Absolutely not. In a pig's eye, in no universe would any academic just be like, sure, take a couple sentences from my work. We all do it. It's like speeding a couple miles per hour over the speed limit. Who's going to give you a ticket for that? These conservatives are just being sticklers and have double set. No, my friend. This is absolutely an interested, a motivated argument that Voss is making because he's on a particular political side. But even leaving that aside for a moment, what he's saying about the degree of her infraction is simply wrong, and he's relying on the general public's ignorance of what academic standards are and ought to be. Because if you've never gone to grad school and somebody says, well, actually, you just have to put out so much material in grad school and you have to do so much that, yeah, sometimes you slip in an accidental chunk here and there from another person's work. If you've never gone to grad school and someone says that, you might, what reason would you have to know whether or not that's true? They're basically relying on their authority as somebody who's done something you haven't done. Well, I have been to grad school. I have written and published academic work. And I am here to tell you that there is no way that if you are trying to do excellent academic work, you would not be horrified, mortified at the revelations that have come out about Gay's work. I know what it takes to make this kind of stuff good, to make a doctoral dissertation good, to make an academic paper good. It's not the same thing as dashing off a Twitter post. It's not the same thing as mouthing off on social media. It is a brutal, back-breaking enterprise. You pore over every sentence and every comma even, and where the placement of every semicolon. You check and you recheck every source, and maybe you make a mistake. Sometimes. Everyone makes mistakes. Of course, that's true. So you might find, if you go back over your old work, that there is something you probably should have cited or something like that. But anytime that happens to you, it torments you, because that's the standard that you hold yourself to if you are genuinely trying to do academic work that is excellent. That's what it takes. That's how seriously good academics take the importance of truth and of honesty in representation of their own work and that of others. This is the core of the discipline. If that doesn't exist, there is no such thing as scholarship. And so this is why people like me get head up when they see people like Gay elevated to positions of power and authority and influence, is because we know that this is no laughing matter. This is not a joke. This is not a game. This is the essence of this thing we love called scholarship. And yes, sometimes you make mistakes. Everybody makes a mistake here and there, but I'm talking minor errors and infractions. This is a woman, Claudine Gay, middle name fake and, is a woman with 17 total published works to her name, which, for those of you that don't know, that's not really a lot for the president of Harvard. That is not Woodrow Wilson levels of contribution to scholarship. But okay, the president's basically an administrator, so she's not got that many works out there. But 8 of them have plagiarism issues, including huge chunks lifted from other books. This is from the Free Beacon, which has been doing a lot of the reporting on this. In 2001, they write, Gay lifts nearly half a page of material verbatim from another scholar, David Cannon, a political science professor at the University of Wisconsin. The article, The Effect of Minority Districts and Minority Representation on Political Participation in California, includes some of the most extreme and clear-cut cases of plagiarism yet. That is not a laughing matter. That's not, oh, whomst among us has not done this. That is really seriously sloppy work. There's a point at which they say Gay borrows 4 sentences from Cannon's 1999 book, Race, Redistricting, and Representation, without quoting. She does not cite Cannon anywhere in or near the passage, though he does appear in the bibliography. The people who tell you that this is just a fillip, just a little oversight, are selling you a bill of goods. And they're the ones who are motivated in their argumentation by the color of this person's skin and by her sex. The people that are happy she's been removed from her position could care less what color or sex she is, truly, honestly, and sincerely. It's the obsessives in the DEI camp who think that since everything is about race and sex to them, it must also be about race and sex to the rest of us. But Chris Rufo and I and anybody that is getting incensed over this matter could not care less about whether Claudine Gay is a woman or a man or black or white or Asian or whatever. That's not the problem with the DEI regime. That's not even the problem with when people talk about Israel in these hideous and nasty ways, as we've seen in many, many institutions, not just Harvard. The problem is not about skin color. The problem is not even about having the wrong opinion that we disagree with. The problem with people like Claudine Gay is that she is a mediocrity and a fraud. She's a fake. She's forcing us to participate in a lie. And I think that this is an element of the whole affair that has kind of gone undernoticed by both the supporters of Gay and her detractors. We're arguing over the nature of DEI. We're arguing over whether the academy can be reformed, whether it just has to be burned to the ground, all of this stuff. We're having all of these different disputes. And I should say, burned to the ground figuratively. Nobody should take me to be calling for violence, but I do think that there are major swaths of these administrations and institutions that need to be just totally defunded and removed. And the reason that I think that is because I am not beholden to anybody's nicety or politeness about, well, she's in this position, so she must have some sort of merit. And by putting people like Claudine Gay in positions like the presidency of Harvard, these DEI apparatchiks force us out of politeness into even a half untruth, even halfway to their lie that they're telling, where we have to say, well, surely, I mean, I don't want to say that she's totally, a worthless academic. This is a person with nothing to contribute to the academic conversation. This is a sloppy, third-rate scholar at best who is picking up chunks of other people's works, not paying any attention to it. And when we are forced to pretend that that person is the same as past presidents of Harvard or just anybody that has ever taught at Harvard, that this is the highest standard that our country can furnish of academic excellence, when we're forced to lie about that, and when we're confronted with people who are frauds, who are lying, who are presenting a sham, who are literally plagiarizing, it's humiliating. It's humiliating to be implicit, or complicit rather, in a lie. It's humiliating to be complicit in a lie. It's humiliating to be forced into a position where you have to either be branded as a nasty, evil heretic or celebrate somebody who obviously does not deserve, on her own merits, the position that she has been elevated to. And so the actual career of Claudine Gay and of all the people who are elevated, I'm sorry, for reasons of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not for reasons of merit, the fact that she's been caught out on plagiarism is actually a perfect academic emblem of what her whole career represents, which is a falsehood, which is posing as something that she really is not. And that is at the heart of what has gone wrong and why academia matters, why the corruption of academia matters, why the corruption of our elites matters, and why people like me who make podcasts like this are so passionate about delivering the truth. Because do we all fall short of that? Absolutely. Do we fail all the time, 100%? We're constantly making mistakes and we're constantly beating ourselves up over it and asking for forgiveness. But the standard is at least there. The ideal should at least be not to make something up so that your preferred political narrative can win out or your preferred group or interest can win out, but to seek truth, goodness, and beauty, and to represent on the outside and in your honors and prestiges and in your academic papers and in every word you speak into a microphone or at the dinner table, to represent what is true in the way that you speak, act, write, and create. And so when we are confronted with people like DEI bureaucrats who aren't even trying to do that, who are in fact trying to do something totally different, who are operating according to a totally different set of standards, we're looking directly at the heart of the corruption that afflicts us, not just in academia, but in government, media, politics, everywhere. It's all about insincerity, falsehood, and fraudulence. And this is why it puts me in mind of a play by William Shakespeare. Basically, everything puts me in mind of a play by William Shakespeare if I sit and think about it long enough. And that's what's masterful about his opus, is that basically everything under the sun is there in Shakespeare. But in particular, this episode has put me in mind of Othello, Shakespeare's play Othello, which coincidentally is also sort of his play about race, but that's not why I'm thinking about it here. It's, in addition to having themes of race in it, Othello has a major through line about honesty, about sincerity, and being the way that you seem. And the big line that I kept coming back to as I was thinking about Claudine Gay and this whole problem of fraudulence, of mediocrity posing as excellence for politically motivated reasons. The line I kept coming back to is, men should be what they seem. And this is sometimes when you spend a lot of time with texts that kind of haunt you from time to time. They'll be playing like a tape in the background thinking, why am I thinking about this? Why am I thinking about this? And I was realizing men should be what they seem. As this gay story was breaking and as everything was going on, I kept thinking men should be what they seem. And this actually has always been a major, I guess, mantra for me, or a standard, let's say, would be a better way of putting it. That's something I would want blazoned on my heraldry. Men should be what they seem. So I wanted to visit that passage and see what it can tell us, not just about Claudine Gay, not just about the issues that I've been talking about in academia, but also about this wider set of concerns that we're dealing with all this year to do with art and morality. What does it mean to tell the truth in art? Just as we've been talking about what it means to tell the truth in scholarship and to hold yourself to a standard of excellence. As always, when I read from any Shakespeare play, I'm using the Folger Shakespeare library texts because my friends at the Folger Shakespeare Library, one of my friends who worked at the time for the Folger Shakespeare Library, sent me a complete set when he heard me talking about how great these editions are. So that's awesome. But they are also really terrific editions. If you're interested in getting started with Shakespeare, this is another example of the kind of text that really benefits from being read aloud, and you can read aloud with people. And in these editions, the introductions are always hit or miss because they're by different people and so on and so forth. But what's great about it is you get facing page notes. So you get a whole page of notes for every page of text, and there are little summaries of each scene. If you're new to Shakespeare, or even just you're trying to figure out something was a little confusing, you can go back to the summary. And this is not an ad, by the way. No, they didn't pay me to say this. I just really love this stuff. So I'm going to begin here not with the man should be what he seems seen, but with Act 1, Scene 1. And just to give an overview of the play and how all this works, fundamentally at the core of this is an issue of jealousy. Two separate issues, actually, of jealousy. Othello is married to the beautiful Desdemona, and he has promoted Cassio over Iago. So Iago is the famous villain of the play, and he is furious because his master Othello has promoted another man above him when he thinks he deserves the promotion. And that's what sets Iago off to drive a wedge between this beautiful love affair between Othello and Desdemona, and to seed doubt and suspicion and dishonesty, because he knows that Desdemona has been true, has not been unfaithful, but he creates these insinuations that Cassio, the guy that's been promoted above him, is sleeping with Desdemona, the wife of the boss. And in his announcement of this, he's one of Shakespeare's great determined villains. That is, like Richard III, he announces his intention to be bad. And Shakespeare understands very deeply that when you do that, you create a paradox within yourself. Because to do the thing that you know is evil is to do something almost self-contradictory. And the reason for this philosophically is when you do something, you do presumably want to achieve an end, right? Even if I just I'm going to pick up my coffee cup now. Why am I going to pick it up? To drink out of it. Why am I going to drink out of it? Because I want some coffee, right? And there's always a because, there's always a why, and at the end you get some end. And almost by definition, that end is what you implicitly believe to be good. If my end is to have energy to record this podcast, then I'm saying I believe this podcast is good. And so if I believe that something were evil, but also did that thing, if I could truly attain that state, then I would be negating my own action even as I did it. It would be like turning inward upon myself. And this is a famous definition of, indeed, satanic or diabolical evil, which Iago certainly invokes to be the great negation or the great negator, the one who does the thing that he also contradicts at the same time. And this is why Satan is ultimately destructive of all things, including himself, is because by turning away from God, turning away from the good, he makes the only choice that can orient him in a fundamentally evil direction that is irredeemable because it is turned inward on itself. So this is what Iago ends up doing, and he gives this famous and chilling speech. I'm just going to do a little part of it. He says, "Were I the Moor," that is, Othello is the Moor, "were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. In following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I, for love and duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end." So that's exactly what I was just defining. It's one thing to make a mistake as you are aiming at the good, as you're trying to do what you believe to be right. It's another thing to place something other than the good, or justice, or excellence, or merit at the top of your hierarchy of virtues. And that's what DEI, for example, does. It says, no, we're not aiming at the best work. We're aiming at the right arrangement of people, and that's what we're going to take to be good. And this is even a step further where Iago says, I know that there are certain things that are good, but I'm enough of a cynic, enough of a nihilist to say, I'm not going to do the good things. I'm going to just adopt the appearance of goodness, sort of like the Ring of Gyges story in Plato's Republic. I'm going to adopt the appearance of goodness to get something that I want. And so my desire is going to be the ultimate standard for me, not what I know to be good. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart in complement extern, 'tis not long after, but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for daws to peck at. I am not what I am. And this is obviously a satanic line because it's the inverse, in some sense, of the moment when Moses sees the burning bush and the bush announces itself as God and says, I am that I am. Ehye asher ehye. This kind of perfect syllogism or perfect mirror and symmetry. I am what I am. God has no distance between the way that he represents himself, what comes out of him, the words he speaks, the way he appears to us. All of that is a perfect and exact representation. And this is, for example, why Paul says of Jesus that he's the image of the invisible God, right? Because God's property is always and everywhere to produce out of himself an exact representation of the thing that cannot be physically touched or seen or understood. So if God is this abstract perfection, and we are these mortal beings with senses. We see things, we touch things, we hear things. The problem is, how do we get access through our senses to the higher things, the truth and the goodness and all of that? And God's answer is, I'm going to place before your senses, in your ears and in your minds and in your eyes and all of that, I'm going to place before your senses accurate representations, perfect expressions. I am what I am. The inward and the outward are as one. They are united. Christ, God and the Father, God the Father and God the Son are one, right? That's the meaning, I think, of all those lines. I and the Father are one. The representation that God puts forward of himself in creation and in the incarnation is identical with, or at least if not the same thing as, then points perfectly and accurately always toward the thing that cannot be touched or seen or thought. And so Iago is saying the opposite of that. I am not what I am. What is going to be outward, the outward seeming is going to not be. The one thing we know is that it's not going to be what's going on inwardly. Inwardly, I want to sow dissension between my master and his love, and outwardly, I'm going to seem to be his best friend and all of that. So that's Iago. Then we have Othello, whose flaw, besides his hot-headedness, is that he's too trusting, he's too naive. But here is what the scene in which Othello and Iago arrive at this line that men should be what they seem, and brilliantly, because it's Shakespeare, there's this masterstroke that it's Iago who introduces the concept first. Because remember, Iago knows what's good. He's actually chosen the opposite of it. He's chosen what is wrong. So this is Act 3, Scene 3, and it's one of these famous scenes where Iago is just carefully dropping these hints about Cassio and Desdemona, but he's also suggesting that he knows more than he feels comfortable saying, and this drives Othello insane. He thinks, Iago keeps saying that he believes in Cassio's honesty and in the righteousness of this pair, but secretly he's suggesting, implying all this other stuff. And so here's Iago. He says to Othello, "For Michael Cassio, I dare be sworn, I think that he is honest." Othello says, "I think so too." And notice already the difference in the way that they speak. Othello is, for all his other flaws, is saying forthrightly. The words that come out of his mouth are almost too perfect a representation of his inward thoughts in this context, because he's dealing with a master dissembler. And Iago says, "I dare be sworn, I think that he is honest." 3 different verbs there in close succession, right? I dare, that is, I'm willing to swear that I think that he is honest. What Othello doesn't know, of course, is that Iago would dare be sworn to anything that suits his purposes, because that's what he's just told us. So on we go. Iago then says, "Men should be what they seem, or those that be not, would they might seem none." Othello certain. Men should be what they seem. And so these two, the same words in the mouth of 2 different men, mean totally different things. Iago is saying, we know, but Othello doesn't, that Iago is saying this ought to be the way, but it is not. And it's especially not the case with me. Othello is simply saying, yes, men should be what they seem. And the tragedy of the play is the downfall of the man who has it right, who has the sincere idea that, although he will certainly fall short of that ideal in some ways, that men should be what they seem. And this is what I'm talking about with the distinction between the way that real academics talk about their work and about mistakes in their work. Real academics, and I do feel comfortable saying real academics as distinct from Claudine Gay, and I suspect many other of these sort of DEI bureaucrats and so forth. Real academics, if caught out in a mistake in their work, are horrified and immediately, express their sincerest horror and angst about the whole situation. The fake academic will cover it all over, minimize it, sweep it away, sweep it under the rug. That's what interested, motivated reasoning looks like. And that's because of a difference in ideals. It's because not of their relative merits as scholars so much as what they are trying to do. And that's the difference between Othello and Iago. It's not that Othello doesn't make mistakes and Iago does. It's that they are oriented toward different ends. They're trying to do different things. Othello is trying to the best of his ability to get to the truth, to express the truth, to speak the truth. Iago is doing the opposite. He has his own agenda, his own desires. He wants what he wants. He's going to get what he wants if he can, any way he can. And words are simply tools, instruments to that end, to his own self-satisfaction, and not to the truth. That fundamental distinction is always and everywhere at work in our lives, because we, being made in the image of God, are representational beings. That is, we are beings of flesh and blood. We are beings who live on earth. We have senses. We experience the world through our senses. And yet, we know from many episodes of this show, but also from our innate experience, that there is something which all of our material lives express. All of the ways that we speak and the sensory experiences that we have, they're not simply the contact of various bodies with other bodies. They are actually symbolical. That is, they communicate something other than themselves. And our experience of the world contains within it a sense that the material world points beyond itself. And this is why an incarnational God makes perfect sense to us, even though it has all these mysteries in it. At the heart is something that is actually quite intuitive, which is God cannot be accessed by the senses, but he comes to us clothed in sensory existence. He is what he is. And the distance between what we are and what we say we are is one way of understanding the nature of sin. And I'm going to dwell on this for a second, because I think this is actually a really big and important idea. If God is what he is, that is, if the outward form that God uses to communicate himself and represent himself is a perfect union between the Father and the Son, then we surely are also meant to be what we are. And it's when that isn't the case that we feel most desperately like failures. It's when the outward and the inward are at odds with one another that we have guilt upon our hearts. And I think that in some sense we are right to feel guilty when that is true. When we lie, when we say one thing and do another, when we do what we don't want to do and don't do what we want to do, then we feel, in the fundamental core of our being, a misalignment between two essential parts of us. And I think that is a contortion of our tripartite nature, of our body and our spirit and the relationship between them, or however you want to figure it, our heart, mind, and soul, as Jesus talks about. All these things we're supposed to love God with. The word that we use in Hebrew to talk about the upright or the perfect man is the word tam. And the word tam means something like complete, or we might even say integrated, with matters of integrity, which are matters of honesty as well. The connection between the outward expression and the inward form of us are core to what we are as images of God, because an image should be accurate. And so when the image that we present of ourselves is inaccurate, there's a deep core level flaw going on in our hearts and in our souls, and I think we feel it. And I think that one reason why everyone everywhere has always had a sort of sense that the world ought to be better than it is because we always experience some distance, some slippage between the perfection of what we know to be right and true, and the stunted, stammering, halting way that we try to aspire and live up to that. And there are various options. You can be like Iago, and you can simply throw out the ideals and say, they're a lie, I don't care about them. You can be like Thrasymachus and say they're all a cloak for power. And then you can simply become a monster and be happy with that. I suspect that in the end you will be tormented like Macbeth with all of the weight of your guilt that you can't escape from because you are wrong and you're lying. It's not a fantasy that there are these ideals. You can alternatively hope that nobody catches you in your lie if you are in a position where you're pretending to be more virtuous, more excellent than you are, which, by the way, is not a situation that is limited to the president of Harvard. You can hope nobody catches you and then live with the fear of always having that distance. Or you can confess. You can state that you are a sinful being in need of mercy and forgiveness, that you're going to try to be what you seem, you're going to try to be what you are, but you're going to fail. And when you fail, you're going to fess up to it as quickly as possible, first to yourself, then to God, then to others. And you're going to seek absolution and mercy. These really are the only psychological options on the table for us, because the world that we live in confronts us with the distance between our ideals and ourselves. And this is what brings me back to this idea that has kind of fixated me lately about the difference between the superlunary and the sublunary realm. I talked about this last week. It's an old idea dating back to antiquity that the moon, which is rotating or revolving around the Earth, actually traces a boundary, like the boundary between two nations or civilizations. And that underneath that boundary, in the sublunary realm, everything is kind of messed up. But beyond that boundary, in the superlunary realm, where the stars are and the sun, and it's sometimes thought the gods, in that realm, things are perfect. And now it's easy for us to look back on that and think, well, they were sure wrong about that. Because we've seen what goes on beyond the moon, and we have Newtonian mechanics, and people have flown to the moon, and everything works the same there. But that, of course, is the inheritance of Isaac Newton. That's because of the scientific revolution that we think, how could anybody ever have thought that? But if we imagine ourselves before that time, it's actually very easy to see how people could have thought that. And it turns out they're not as dumb as we might imagine that they were, because what they were really doing was they were looking at the world, and they were seeing in the world, as we all do, signs, otot umoedim, as the book of Genesis says. That is, the stars, as they move in their courses, manifestly seem to be expressing something more than simply their mathematical relationships or their material composition. And one of the things that seems to be embedded into them is order, perfection, harmony, just the way that they return each year to the same position, that the sun moves gradually along the ecliptic, and yet they also are able to countenance certain forms of motion that's interrelated. Ultimately, it was going to become clear that the law of gravitation helps to outline, trace some of the patterns, and Kepler's laws also do the same for planetary motion. But fundamentally, from the beginning, it's been clear that there is this orderly repetition, this cyclical motion that we observe from Earth that expresses harmony, order, and beauty. And so the world communicates that to us automatically. We don't have to do anything. This is not something that we impose upon the world. It's not something we're trying to do out of wishful thinking. This is just the way we experience the world. These are qualities that are inherent in our encounter with the material world, and they suggest something to us about the ideal. Which is why when we come down into our world and we find that we too have ideals, but we do not live up to them. And in fact, even our calendars can never quite get right the rotations of the sun as they relate to the revolutions of the moon and all of these different things that kind of keep jamming up. The gears keep jamming where we are. And this is why it is natural to think, well, we must be in a more chaotic realm that is a little bit more skewed and messed up. And so beyond us, there is some perfection. With us, there is the idea of perfection, but also disunity and disharmony. And you know what? That's still true. Even though we know that it's not a physical boundary, we still encounter this problem, and we still feel at the depths of our being a terrible pain if there's a disjuncture between what we say and what we do, what we are and what we seem. And we feel, as we read Shakespeare, we know, or as we see these scenes performed, we know that Iago is an embodiment of something deeply destructive. That if, to the extent we let in Iago into our own lives, into our own hearts, we have destroyed ourselves. We have ruined ourselves because we are good-seeking creatures. That's the nature of everything we do. And when we seek evil instead, or simply abandon any virtuous concept of the good, we turn inward upon ourselves and eat ourselves alive. What this means, and this is where it all turns out actually to have a lot to do with what we've been saying about art and so on and so forth. What this means is that we are works of art who are working from a model. That is, we're trying to express something about what we should be, and we're not just trying to perfect ourselves, whatever that would mean. We actually have an idea in our head, even though it's dim and it's distanced from us and it's kind of difficult to see sometimes through the fog of our desires. We have an idea of how things ought to be. And it's communicated to us by creation and by the world. And it's also inwardly in our hearts, this idea that there's something we're trying to live up to when we are attempting to pursue virtue and act justly and rightly and so forth. We know that we're crippled in this sense. That's why being crippled is one of the major ways that the Bible and Jesus and the prophets talk about humanity, is that we are the lame and the blind. And yet we also know that there is such a thing as sight, that there is such a thing as walking upright and being on the right path. So what we're really trying to do is adjust what we seem to what we long to be. We want what we seem to be as we are in the sight of God in heaven, the way that the stars beyond the moon seem to be perfect. They seem to be exactly what they are supposed to be, doing and obeying exactly as they ought to. And the laws of nature seem like types of how we ought to obey the moral law. And what that means is that we have this kind of artistic model that we are trying to aspire to and live up to. This idea is expressed very beautifully in the opening of a text that I have read before on this show, and I want now to revisit because it will haunt us, I think, as we're talking about art and morality and these questions of art and morals. And that's Giorgio Vasari, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. I'm reading this translation by Gaston C. de Ver, which is a great name, and it's the Modern Library Classics edition. The book's a doorstopper, but don't be scared off by that because this is a wonderful coffee table book, funnily enough. And actually, I do have a coffee table edition of it with all the different artwork that Vasari is talking about, illustrated and so forth. But what I mean by it's a good coffee table book is you can dip into it. This is the first true work of art history, and it's a description of the development of a certain style of art out of the Byzantine era, that after the church kind of took over Europe and pagan art and classical art had declined, Vasari thinks, then there was this recovery, this renaissance. And it's his word, rinascita, which in Italian means rebirth, that ultimately will become translated into French as Renaissance, and that's where we get the word Renaissance. This is the inventor of the Renaissance. But that's all amazing. But even beyond all of that, that's not really what I'm here to talk about. I want to read to you just this opening portion about who invented art. Because Vasari is sort of talking about, well, the Chaldeans did this or that, the Egyptians had these relief sculptures and so forth. But I will surely say that both one and the other of these arts, that is sculpture and painting, I think he's talking about, both one of the other of these arts, the design which is their foundation, nay, rather the very soul that conceives and nourishes within itself all the parts of man's intellect, was already most perfect before the creation of all other things, when the Almighty God, having made the great body of the world, and having adorned the heavens with their exceeding bright lights, descended lower with his intellect into the clearness of the air and the solidity of the earth. I think there's a lot of Italian kind of new Platonism in here. That's a major part also of this context. But descended lower with his intellect into the clearness of the air and the solidity of the earth, and shaping man, discovered, together with the lovely creation of all things, the first form of sculpture, from which man afterwards, step by step, and this may not be denied, as from a true pattern, there were taken statues, sculptures, and the science of pose and outline. And for the first pictures, whatsoever they were, softness, harmony, and the concord in discord that comes from light and shade. He goes on, this is a brilliant passage. He's saying, God, in creating man and in creating the world, laid forth the archetype, laid forth the image that we are aspiring to produce when we make art. And our task, we are works of art, our lives are works of art, and our task as artists when we make art is to bring forth from ourselves a material embodiment of the world as we see it. Because what God has done in making us is he's created not just humanity, but he's created the way that humanity sees the world. He makes the sun and the moon and stars and all this stuff before us in Genesis. But it's not the way that we see it, right? Because we see things in a specific human way. And by creating humanity, God also creates human perception and human experience. And so we then have this task, not just in what we would classically think of as works of art, that is, when we paint and when we sculpt and so forth, but just in general, as images of God, to bring forth the human way of seeing the world. And that's why being as we seem and being honest and being clear and true is such an essential feature of what we are, and why the disconnection between our inward experiences, our inward longings, our inward aspirations and desire, the disconnection between that and the way we act and the things we say and the terrible lies we tell, the disconnect between those two things is the fundamental sickness of our hearts. It is original sin in some profound sense. And I know that it might sound crazy to link this scandal going on at Harvard to the core essence of original sin. But on the other side, it's actually not all that crazy if you think about it, because whatever we are going through as a nation, it's clear that we are sick in some deep way that goes far, far beneath any particular infraction or problem. And I think, and one of the aims of this show is to demonstrate to you how individual news stories are actually just little outward emanations of something much, much deeper, some sickness at the heart of what's going on with us that requires a realignment of honesty and integrity. I am not going to give you a political prescription on this episode for how we need to do that at the national level. I'm always concerned first and foremost with you and me and how it is that we are to recover. I think that let 1,000 Chris Rufos bloom, right? Let 1,000 Rufos go forth and unseat 1 million DEI bureaucrats. I think all of these people should be hounded out of their positions of power and influence, because clearly they represent the worst of what's going on with us. That all needs to happen, and I think it's a good playbook. And obviously Rufo, if you read his interview with Politico that he gave, he lays out very clearly what he intends and how he hopes to at least perhaps reform, I should say, or at least shame these Ivy League institutions. Meanwhile, it's our concern to think about how to build and how to move forward. And it seems to me that the first task in front of us is to think seriously about integrity, about erasing fraud from our own lives. Solzhenitsyn, the great dissident of the Soviet regime, who was imprisoned in the Gulag and wrote this massive Gulag archipelago, but also gave a number of beautiful speeches, gave a speech in which he said the first step in resisting an oppressive regime is the personal non-participation in lies. Regimes that are dishonest cannot bear any individual opting out of lies, which is why the dishonesty of somebody like Claudine Gay feels humiliating, is because you are co-opted into it in some sense when these institutions that are supposed to represent your nation are such frauds. There's that element of it, but it also means that your power in not participating in these lies is immense. And this informs, I think, the question that we are going to go forward and think about. I've got Plato and Milton waiting to talk about. I'm going to save them for next week because I want to now return to this question of art, of morality and art that we've been wrestling with and grappling. And I almost said wrestling. We've been wrestling with this question about art. And this here question, I think, is very closely related to this whole episode that we've just been talking about, integrity and being what you seem, because we have struggled with the fact that art is obviously not amoral in the way that maybe our libertarian brothers and sisters would like it to be, and certainly in the way that our bohemian 19th century Oscar Wildes and those kind of lovable layabouts would have liked it to be. This l'art pour l'art, ars gratia artis, art for art's sake, aesthetic bliss, Vladimir Nabokov, D.H. Lawrence, or whoever, that ain't gonna work. It doesn't work because of what I said earlier about the good, that whenever you do anything, whenever you represent human life, you are implicitly acting out an idea, a vision of the good. And so that does not mean that your art has to only include characters who never swear and never get naked and never do sex and never say the bad things. It does mean that as you perceive and understand the world, and that includes your moral sensibilities, the art that you make, the words that you say, the things that you write must be honest. They must represent the world, including if there are things about it that you do not understand that give you pause and trouble. You must represent the world as it is. And left and right are both failing on this right now. The left is failing because it wants to use art to muscle the world into a false and caricatured and frankly ugly and evil vision of the future in which everybody is sexually fluid in a million different ways and race is the most important thing. And I'm really, I was going to say I'm exaggerating. I'm not so sure that I am exaggerating. I think there is an implicit idea that everything should always be as multiracial as possible, and that is in itself a good. And that's why we have to change all of these fairy tales to have all these different people in them, and why we have to fundamentally reimagine Nordic myths so that we imagine there were Vikings who were black or whatever. Not that we object to black people in roles, it's that this ratchet, which is moving in this direction, is obviously motivated by a sickly idea of human life. And so the art that it produces is dishonest. You end up with things like Stacey Abrams as president of planet Earth, which is a real thing that happened on a real episode of Star Trek. If you don't believe me, take my word for it. You don't have to go watch it. Star Trek Discovery, I think, maybe. I'm going to get this wrong because there are so many Star Treks. But this really happened, and nothing that any ham-fisted, table-pounding, conservative Nudnik has created, nothing that any evangelical church has ever put out could possibly be as cringe or as lame as Stacey Abrams as president of planet Earth. That's not art because it is dishonest, or at least it's bad art because of its dishonesty. But we also have this reaction from the right that says, well, therefore, what we need is the art of the superlunary realm. We need art that reflects these perfections that we experience in the world, the high classical ideal of beauty. And that's closer to what's right, I think. That's closer to the truth. But if that's where you stop, you are again going to end up with a form of dishonesty. And it's the form of dishonesty that you get from a movie like God's Not Dead, where, as I recall, at the end, spoiler alert, the atheist professor is like run over by a car. And we're supposed to be happy about this because he's accepted Jesus Christ into his heart. And I'm sorry, but that is also a dishonest depiction of human life. It's not happy, even when somebody is saved, and we're grateful that he accepts Jesus and all of that. These are good things. But we're lying when we say that, and that means that death and sickness and pain don't hurt anymore, or they just seem fine, and they can be the happy ending to a movie. And we do this kind of lying because we're trying so hard. We're straining with like our neck muscles popping out. We're straining to represent the world as superlunary realm of the stars and virtue and perfection. And the problem is that we actually do live in the sublunary realm. And so honesty in art and sincerity in art and excellence, morality in art includes true depictions also of our failings, also of our brokenness, and of our moral aspirations of the world as it is. And so, as always on this show this year, we are going to continue thinking about what that would mean and how that would look. But I just wanted to point out that we are now seeing why it is that this issue is so urgent and matters so deeply is because that distance, right? And this actually moves the ball forward, I think, in our conversation about this matter, because it shows us precisely what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the jagged slippage between the superlunary and the sublunary realm, and our efforts to bring ourselves back into alignment, to be what we seem, both in politics and in academia, and also in art, and in the honesty of the creations that we make. And it's a tricky business because narrow is the road, right? We're aligning ourselves onto the razor's edge of the ideal, while also confessing and not denying, like Iago or whoever, confessing the ways that we fall short. And I think that we are so sick with dishonesty that we have almost forgotten the power of aspiring to tell the truth in art, in politics, in academia, everywhere. Checking your sources, laboring over those footnotes, stressing out over the placement of a comma. It's not just, as Claudine Gay's defenders will say, it's not just a matter of no consequence. It's not just something that pedants in obscure conservative think tanks are getting stressed out about. It's the jot and the tittle, the little minor representations of the largest thing in the world, which is that a man should be what he seems. That's it for me this week, I think. I'm going to do a question now from the mailbag. And for those of you that are new here, first of all, welcome. Very, very glad you're here. If you want to ask me questions, if you want to be in the mailbag, you can do that by signing up for my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And there are some things that you will get on there. If you want to support me, if you want to pay to support me, I really appreciate that. You can become a paid subscriber and you'll get, for example, the audiobook of Paradise Lost that I'm making. You'll get some advance notice of certain things and live stream Q&As and so forth. But even free subscribers can be in the mailbag, and you do get a weekly essay. I also want to mention, before I go on to this mailbag question, that there is another Substack I'm really excited to tell you about. And it's just a preview for now, but you can subscribe. If you go over now to thenewjerusalem.substack.com, you will find a Substack that my father, no relation, Andrew Clavin, and I are making together. It's a project that's very dear to our hearts. We've been thinking about it for a long time. It's going to be a conversation, the kind of thing I think you might have once called a lettered exchange, a series of emails and essays that we write back and forth to each other in public that aim to bring you guys into the deep and intimate intellectual relationship that we have had basically for as long as I've been able to form an English sentence. My dad and I'm very lucky that my father and I are not only close as father and son, we are also friends, and we are on the same page intellectually. That is, we like talking about the same things. We are concerned especially about what faith looks like in this fraught moment in 2024, I guess it is now. And we want to invite you into that conversation by producing this Substack together. So if you go over there to thenewjerusalem.substack.com, you will find where you can subscribe and sign up. And there is also a paid tier there where you'll get a list that we're building of all the works and books and works of literature that are most speaking to this moment for us. But either at there or at rejoiceevermore.substack.com, you can ask me questions. And that is why I am now drawing on a question from Rejoice Evermore for the mailbag here, and it's from Stephen. Stephen writes, what would be your standard for considering a work of literature to merit notoriety? He's pointed out this perennial problem that often when you ask your literary professors, your English teachers, what makes a work great, they'll give you different answers, they'll give you examples, but they can't nail down a standard. Would all these notable works there be important exemplars of the Western canon? What does it take for new works to prove themselves significant to the Western canon? Since Harry Potter and the Hunger Games are significant movers in today's culture, does that mean they're comparable to the likes of To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankenstein, Pride and Prejudice, or Shakespeare? Or what do the former lack that the latter possess? Are we going to hear you make an episode on Harry Potter as a product of the West like you do for Macbeth? Okay. I actually really love Harry Potter. You probably won't hear me do an episode about it unless I mention it in passing as part of something else. And there's a reason for that, and I'm going to try to use that as a piece of this answer because this is a huge question, and ultimately when you're dealing with matters of taste, I would recommend reading Edmund Burke on taste, but you're never going to come up with a formula because it's not a mathematical issue. It's an issue of the spirit and of the heart's engagement with another mind or with another heart in a work of literature and art. And the reason I'm answering this question today is because I think at least one core criterion of greatness in a literary work is that it speak profoundly to the human condition. And it can do so in any number of media, but it has to mimetically, that is in Aristotle's definition of a mimetic work, which reproduces or represents something, it has to speak profoundly to the human condition and do so honestly. That's why I've been harping about that this week, in part is because honesty and profound clarity and truth about the human condition is a major, I think, element of what it takes to be great. It does not, on the other hand, have to make a splash. Many great works of literature initially did not make a splash, or were hidden, or were hated by the public. John Keats, if you visit John Keats's grave in Rome, he wanted his gravestone to say, "Here lies one whose name was writ on water," because he had not accomplished anything. He thought he hadn't accomplished anything that he wanted. He died very young. He died tending his brother and caught his brother's tuberculosis and died. And he thought that he was a total failure. It is possible for a work to have no influence in its day and to be recognized afterward as containing greatness. And in fact, even Shakespeare's reputation was greatly elevated after his death. At the time, you would have said, "Oh yeah, there's Bill Shakespeare, there's Chris Marlowe, there's a bunch of playwrights, in the Elizabethan stage, and others might even have been thought to be better than Shakespeare." But we gradually, over time, we recognize his greatness. And so that's another thing, I think, is that time winnows out. And it takes like 40 to 100 years for time really to winnow out. We don't even reckon, I think, with the degree to which the stuff that survives is a tiny sliver of these vast literary outputs. There are people who have these Elvis-level reputations that then vanish altogether and are forgotten about. We don't know how that will shake out in the future, and that in part means that it's difficult to really firmly predict what's going to be part of the canon in 100 years. I think Harry Potter has some worthwhile stuff in it, but you really have to realize that things which are now on everybody's mind can vanish, can disappear, and will within a couple generations. Maybe a couple books by Stephen King will endure, but you have to understand that even though King is great now, there's most of his stuff will be out of print. I mean, there are a lot of things that seem to loom large that will disappear and really become footnotes. On the other hand, there might be stuff that's currently going on online that's sort of small and indie that we remember with this enormous power. Time and good criticism does perform that winnowing, but you can't do it in advance. The only thing you can do is seek that criterion of speaking profoundly to the human experience, be it through language or music or the visual or what have you. Aristotle says of tragedy that the objects of imitation are men in action. That is, people doing stuff. And there are lots of things now that people talk about, that they love, that they're really into, that I just do not think really. I mean, the Hunger Games is a good example. Like, I don't think you can make the case legitimately and with your face hanging out that the Hunger Games speaks as profoundly to the human predicament and the human condition of all the stuff we've been talking about on this episode as profoundly as even To Kill a Mockingbird, let alone Pride and Prejudice or Shakespeare. So I'm going to lay that criterion out for you as one major winnowing principle. There are others, and as I say, read Edmund Burke on taste to get a feel for how these disputes sometimes go. But ultimately, I think you're never going to get a system that is indisputable, that doesn't leave you arguing over what to include and what not to include in the list. Anyway, it's an eternal conversation. Glad to be a part of it with you. Very glad you're here with me. Please do subscribe to The New Jerusalem and to Rejoice Evermore. Check out my book, How to Save the West. Subscribe to this podcast if you're not already. Wherever you're listening, drop us a 5-star review. Anything that you can contribute to help out would be really appreciated. Just love being here with you, and I'm so grateful that you are part of this journey. That's it for me this week. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.